So my name is Mike Reddington, and I'm a certified forensic interviewer. And once again, I can't thank you enough for allowing me to interrupt your lunch. I really appreciate you hanging out with me, especially considering the monsoon that you had to navigate to get here. And just to get started, I mean, who could be a more perfect individual to talk to you guys about international and multicultural communication than a guy who grew up in New Hampshire and married a woman from Alabama? I think that alone should make me an expert. I think other people disagree, but I'm going to run with it. Aaron gave a great brief description to get us started. Really, as a certified forensic interviewer, my job or our jobs as CFIs come down to one thing, and that is how do we make people feel more comfortable sharing the truth with us? How do we get people in situations where they decided no matter what happens today, I'm not telling Mike anything, at the end of the day to shake our hands and feel better about sharing that information with us. And after they share that information with us, we take a look at it and we say, well, when you look at all of the techniques that we use and the processes that we go through, they're strikingly similar to some of the processes and the business communications that we all have to have throughout our career, and really creates an opportunity to integrate those in order to teach and create some new processes. And that's where we came up with the disciplined listening method. And we'll get into that in a little bit as we get going. And really what I would like to do is just start you off with an experience that I had on an international level with communication. And then we'll get into the meeting. So I've been blessed in many ways, including with the opportunity to travel all over the world and visit some fantastic places and make some phenomenal friends as a result. Thankfully for me, most of my international business travel started in Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe. It's where people tend to speak English and their customs are relatively similar to ours. So it's like travel with training wheels. It was great. Then a couple years ago, I got a phone call and found myself invited to spend 11 days traveling the Middle East and North Africa, teaching these same communication techniques. That trip's going to be a little bit different, right? So for myself, having no experience, direct experience with that part of the world, as the months ticked down to weeks and I was getting ready to go, I found myself spending the majority of my free time doing two things. One, making sure that I was educated and aware on how to communicate and what to do and what not to do in that part of the world. And two, convince my wife I was going to be fine and be home safe and it was nothing to worry about and I'd bring her back some cool souvenirs. So when the time came, I kissed my wife goodbye, said I'll be home in 2 weeks, I love you, got on the plane and took off. Now, how many of you have been on or like to go on vacation, exotic places, beaches, hang out, relax, right? You know how it feels when you go on vacation? You're on the plane and you're all excited, right? Then you land. And when you get off the plane, you walk into the airport. And now most of these airports, they like to share the ambiance of the local festivities, right? So if you go to the beach, you walk in and there's palm trees and margaritas, or you go to the mountains and there's mountains everywhere. And you get off the plane and you think to yourself, I'm here. Well, after something like 27 hours of traveling from Chicago to Abu Dhabi via Frankfurt, I walk off the plane, get smacked in the face with humidity, look around the airport and go, well, I'm here. A little bit of a shock to be 2/3 of the way around the world for the very first time. So the next morning, I have to be up in Dubai to teach a presentation, and thankfully the first hour went very well, and so I give everybody the first break. The majority of programs we teach are somewhere between 16 and 24 hours, 2 to 3 days. So an hour into the first day, I give a break. And I was kind of recapping some of the things that I had been studying before I went over there. Being in Dubai for the first day, I know I'm going to have quite the international group. I'm going to have people from the Middle East, I'm going to have people from Asia, I'm going to have people from Europe. So there's a lot of things to make sure I do and don't do. Things that are very common here in the United States. For instance, I need to make sure that I don't give anybody the thumbs up sign. That could be taken the wrong way. I want to make sure I don't want to give anybody the A-OK sign. That can be taken the wrong way. A lot of cultures find it very rude to point. A lot of cultures find it very rude to show the stop sign. If there's anybody from the UK, I've got to make sure that how I show two very carefully, because that's how you would give somebody the middle finger in the UK as opposed to just using the one finger we're all such a fan of here in the United States. So I'm sitting there, first break, recapping. I haven't done anything I'm not supposed to yet. And then I start thinking to myself, how am I going to do this for 16 hours? Do you know how many times in a 2-day presentation I'll ask a question, and thankfully somebody in the back will raise their hand and start to answer? but there's always a smart kid in the front. It just happens to be you this time. And as the guy in the back starts answering, the guy in the front starts to answer as well. He's got to get his answer in. So me trying to be nonchalant about it, I'll typically go ahead. And as the guy in the back starts answering and this guy starts talking, I'll be like, hang on a second. And then as he continues to talk, because you're so smart and you want me to know about it, now I see that he's got a good answer, so I'm listening to both. And as I'm nodding along with the gentleman in the back, I'm telling this guy, good job, you got it, hang on, I'll be right back. I don't know about you, but I don't want to get arrested in Dubai. So I'm sitting in the front of the room going, this is going to be a long day for me, hands in pockets, right? So obviously as part of my preparation as well, I looked into things like dining expectations and gender relation expectations. And one of the interesting things I found as well was in that part of the world, lengthy extended handshakes can be the norm. So back to first morning, Dubai, 1 hour in, give everybody a break, take a drink of water. And here comes a gentleman from the back. He's from Dubai. He's dressed very, very traditionally. He's an older gentleman. And he's walking towards me with a big smile and his hand extended. So he walks up and introduces himself. So I start shaking his hand. He asked me how I'm doing. I said, great. He asked me how my flight was. I said it wasn't bad. He asked me if this is my first time in Dubai. I say it is. He asked me if everybody's taking great care of me. I say they are. Then he starts telling me how he enjoyed the first hour. He's really looking forward to the presentation, which is good. I appreciate that. Then he starts telling me about his business. He's still shaking my hand. Now, I wish I could tell you everything he said to me, but I can't. I was listening to about 1/3 of what he was saying. See, my brain was having 3 conversations. 1/3 of my brain was trying to listen to what he was telling me. 1/3 of my brain was listening to the voice of rational Mike, saying, you knew about this, you're prepared for this is normal, it's okay. The other 1/3 of my brain was listening to irrational Mike going, dude, get out of here, this is weird. Now, thankfully, rational Mike prevailed, and he was an extremely nice gentleman, and I had a wonderful 11 days and had a bunch of experiences that I wish we all could have, especially in that part of the world. So it was a wonderful trip for me, and I shared that little story with you to start, really for 2 reasons. The first is obviously for any situation, the better prepared we are, the more we will be ready for these types of things when they happen. However, let me assure you, the shock of some of these things happening is still fresh when it does happen, no matter how well you prepare. And the second is, and I'm sure this is common sense for all of us, across the world, in many cultures, things that are taboo in one part of the world might be completely normal and completely acceptable in another part of the world. And we use that to segue into what we refer to as the disciplined listening method. And we've built the disciplined listening method based off of the world's leading non-confrontational interview and interrogation techniques and integrated them with some of your standard best practices for business communications and a lot of the cutting edge, up-to-date research both in communication and in business as well. And as we get into this, I would like to ask you guys a couple questions. I know you're still busy eating, so we'll just do this with a raising of hands so nobody has to worry about spitting any chicken out. Real quick, do me a favor. Raise your hand if you like to purchase things, if you like to buy stuff, if you like to go shopping. Okay, that's good. Now, raise your hands again if you like feeling sold. You like feeling that the salesperson really got one over on you. Nobody? All right, let me ask you this. When you do make purchases, especially large-scale purchases, how many of you like to get a good deal? Unanimous again, I like that. How many of you like to feel haggled with? I'm still drawing blanks. All right, last one. When you talk with people, personally and professionally, how many of you like to get the truth? How many of you prefer to have people honest with you? Okay? Depends on the topic. We'll have a conversation later.
Sure.
Now let me ask you this. How many of you like feeling interrogated? Nobody? Not even one person with a sick sense of humor that just wants to try it? None of us like feeling interrogated. None of us like feeling sold. None of us like feeling haggled with. So what we've done is we've worked hard to put together a process that allows us to walk step by step through these conversations to help people feel comfortable sharing this information with us, that allows us to walk away reaching better agreements, reaching better deals, and creating better relationships along the way. Yes, I do conduct a fair amount of interviews and interrogations. No, I don't have a 100% confession rate. I don't know anybody that does. But I can say with pride that every single interview and interrogation I've ever done has ended in a handshake. And that's the important piece for us. So as we start thinking about the international application and the multicultural application of what we do, there's a couple things that we should keep in mind to start. And I think the obvious place to start is some differences that we run into around the world. And with the time that we have, just to broadly categorize them, some of the differences we run into are proximity. Depending on where you are in the world, depends on how close people are comfortable when they're communicating. Things like eye contact, things like protocols and norms for how business conversations are conducted, concepts of honor, concepts of seniority, the actual words that we speak, the tone of voice that we use, and of course, varying parts of nonverbal behavior. Did I mention eye contact? Eye contact would be one of those as well. So these are things that can be different a lot of places that we travel, not just around the world, but even here across the United States. Two quick examples. The United States is very much a don't touch me culture. In fact, by the numbers, as a general rule, if we're not comfortable with people, we don't want them within 1.5 feet of us. And for some people, it might be even a little bit further. But if I don't know you, don't come within 1.5 feet of me. I'm watching some relationships digress as I speak. However, there are many Latin American and Mediterranean cultures that greet complete strangers with hugs and kisses. And that's just naturally part of how they greet each other as part of their cultural norm. When you think about eye contact, here in the United States, especially in the Northeast where I'm from, eye contact is considered a sign of respect. However, there are many cultures and countries, particularly in Asian cultures, where eye contact is considered a sign of disrespect. It's actually respectful to avert eye contact. So if we don't become aware of some of these, we could think somebody's being disrespectful when in fact they're being respectful, or we could try to respect somebody and accidentally disrespect them. So of course it's very important to make ourselves generally aware of some of the differences that we have to account for. However, I think it's also important to talk about similarities. We are all people. There are plenty of things that we all have in common around the world. Now, when it comes to nonverbal behavior, displays of nonverbal behavior that we show worldwide, there is one group of behavior that is consistent around the world, no matter where we live, no matter where we're from. And that is how we display emotion on our face. Research has discovered 7 physical displays of emotion that are the same no matter where you're from in the world. Happy, sad, anger, disgust, fear, surprise, and contempt. No matter where you're from in the world, you show these 7 emotions the exact same way on your face. Now, a little bit of interesting information. In the last 1.5 years or so, a research group from Ohio State published a study that said it's not 7, it's actually over 20, because some of these emotions can be combined to make unique expressions of emotion on their own. For instance, you can be angrily surprised, or you can be happily surprised. Those would be 2 different emotions. At the same time, a group from Glasgow published a research study that said it's not 7, it's not in the 20s, it's actually 4. Because when you look at the similarities between how fear and surprise and anger and disgust are displayed, the first half of the display are so similar that they believe when we show expressions on our face, the first half of that expression is so we understand what we're feeling, and the second half is so the people we're communicating with can understand what we're feeling, and therefore there's only 4. I would contend that the number is irrelevant. Really, the core piece that's important to remember is that no matter where we're from in the world, we do show these emotions the same way. However, we have different display rules depending on where we're from in the world. Some cultures are more expressive, and some cultures are more reserved. So in more expressive cultures, you're more likely to see greater displays of emotion, longer displays of emotion, more public displays of emotion. And in more reserved cultures, you're likely to see quicker, more muted, and very few public displays of emotion. Now, the key takeaway for us in that scenario is that when we're talking to people from either reserved cultures or from more expressive cultures, it can be important for us to match those same display rules. So that way, if I'm from Boston and I'm used to lighting my face up every time something exciting happens, and I'm talking to somebody from a more reserved culture, maybe someplace in Asia, that I don't come off as rude, arrogant, blustery, or disrespectful by lighting my face up every time we talk about something that's fun. So it's important to match those as well. And we're going to use those as examples to really start getting into the disciplined listening process. When we talk about the disciplined listening process, it is a communication, evaluation, and execution process that we use. It's a cycle, it's a flow, and what we'll do is we'll break it down into 5 components. And with the time that we have, we'll break down each of the 5 components very quickly here, and then we'll go through and hit a couple of the highlights for each of the 5. And then later on, if we've got time for questions, I'll stick around and I'll answer, and I'll be happy to expand on any of the questions that you have. So as we go through this disciplined listening process, this applies to sales conversations, this applies to negotiations, this applies to leadership coaching conversations, this applies to obviously interviewing, especially if you're going to be interviewing to hire somebody to join your team. It applies to being interviewed, for those of you that will be out in the workforce very soon, hopefully. Of course, on the criminal side, it can apply to some of the interrogations that we do as well. I have to be careful because my wife knows that it applies to personal conversations too, so you got to be careful with that sometimes. So what we'll do quickly is we'll just talk about the 5 components of the disciplined listening process. The first one is awareness and anticipation. And if there is one word that I can leave you with today, it is anticipation. The more accurately and the more thorough we can anticipate the variables in any one of our conversations, the more we can prepare for them. And the more prepared we are, the more successful we can be. So anticipation is going to be very key. When I interact with somebody, how are they likely to react? What are their interests likely to be? What are their obstacles likely to be? What do I need to be prepared for, especially in multicultural conversations, to make sure I keep it moving in the direction that I need it to? On top of anticipation, awareness is obviously very important as well. That's awareness of who we're speaking with, where we're having the conversation, and awareness of how we are behaving and conducting ourselves as well. So that common thread is really going to permeate the entire process. But when we move on from that initial anticipation and awareness building process, then we go into a strategic preparation. And with that strategic preparation, what we want to do is we want to come up with a plan or a strategy that we believe will allow us to execute our goals, reach the best agreement that we believe we can, while running into the minimal amount of resistance possible throughout the process. Now, once we've got that plan in place, it's time to act. It's time to go sit down and have a conversation. Whether it's going to be face-to-face, whether it's going to be over the telephone, over email, whatever mode that we have available to communicate. And once we start that communication process, it is going to be very important to start evaluating all of the verbal, and if it's face-to-face, all of the nonverbal behavior that we're seeing as well. We're going to spend a couple of minutes on this coming up and talk about how we can take the verbal and nonverbal behavior we're witnessing and turn it into a real strategic advantage. Graduate beyond just a trivial identification and really take the information that we're seeing, create an advantage, integrate it into our strategy, and achieve more with it. Now, as we're in the process and we are evaluating and we are adapting our approach as we go through the conversation, it's going to be very important to help people save face, especially in international conversations, multicultural conversations, concepts of honor, concepts of respect, concepts of responsibility, idea ownership can vary in importance from high to super high, depending on where we are in the world. So it is going to be very important that we allow people to save face as we reach an agreement. What's more important, getting the agreement that you're looking for or getting credits for the agreement that you're looking for? I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary of being married. I've kept her around this long. I think I'm in the clear. When Brooke and I told everybody that we were getting married, I had a friend of mine pull me aside and say, remember, happy wife, happy life. Many of you have probably heard that as well. It's not about being right, it's about being happy. If that's how we live and operate at home, that should also be how we live and operate in business as well. It's not about being right, it's about being happy or being successful. And then in order to achieve that, we need to make sure that we're asking effective questions. I'm sure you guys have all heard throughout your education the importance of asking open-ended questions and not closed-ended questions, even though we still find ways to screw that up quite often. So towards the end of the presentation, we'll quickly talk about 2 quick questioning techniques we can use in order to help generate more responses, which gives us more to evaluate and therefore more intelligence to integrate into the plan that we have. So now what we'll do is we'll take a couple minutes with each one of these, and we'll break them down and spend a little bit of time giving some takeaways that we can take out and we can start integrating in any conversation that we have, hopefully starting today. So first, when we talk about anticipation and awareness, the first bullet point might sound a little obvious, but clarify your goals. Don't just come up with a goal, this is what I want to achieve, or this is what I want to get out of it. Be very clear with yourself. What exactly are you looking to achieve? What constitutes a successful agreement for you? And by the way, what are several iterations of a successful agreement for you? If in a perfect world, this is what I want. But if I don't live in a perfect world, what's going to come second, what's going to come third? We prepare that in advance. Now, we also want to make sure that we're taking into account the cultural differences as well. And I know this is kind of a vague bullet point that's up there, but it's very important to consider, especially at the awareness and anticipation phase. How are we similar? How can we leverage that? How are we different? And how do I need to account for that? Showing respect is going to be one of the most important processes of any conversation that we have. It's not just thinking about what will stop us. It's really thinking about what will help us as well. Sir?
Michael, will you be able to get a copy of your slides?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So from there, we want to start going into our strategic planning process. And the title for this slide we came up with was Strength from Weakness. A lot of times when people are planning for a conversation, I think it's very easy for us to say, okay, this is where I'm strong, or this is where I'm powerful, or this is where I'm confident. And we build our conversation from there. We start with where we feel strong or confident. And we do that in order to try to hide or compensate or stay away from where maybe we're weak or we feel exposed or we're not so confident. And that's the wrong way to do it. What we need to do is prepare to our strengths, not from our strengths. So that means we need to prepare from our weaknesses towards our strengths. By doing so, we get to control when the information that we consider to be our weakness enters the conversation. We control how it is framed. We control whether or not we can minimize it. We can address it at a time that's beneficial to us. At the same time, that allows us to build a greater perception in our strengths or confident areas. So that way, by the time we get there, we're in a much better position than we would be if we started there to begin with. One of our favorite analogies that we like to use is take bullets out of guns. And maybe that's not the best analogy. Maybe I need to come up with a less confrontational way to say it. If you and I were in a confrontation, I hope this never happens, by the way. You and I each have one firearm, and there's one bullet on the table. I imagine whoever gets to that bullet first is in complete control of how this conversation goes. So if we're going to have a conversation with somebody, one of the things that we like to do is we like to say, okay, from a weakness standpoint or from an exposure standpoint, what are some of the information or areas that might be used against me? And how can I use them first? So that way I can control when, where, and how they're discussed, and I can use it to make my strengths appear even stronger. Once we've considered that and we start building our plan, we build it backwards. We reverse engineer it. We don't start from the beginning and say, okay, we're at A, and we need to go to B, C, D, E, all the way to Z. We do it backwards. We start at Z and say, okay, I've got to get to Y, I've got to get to X, and I'm going to build it backwards. When we build our plans forward, it typically can have a limiting scope. When we see obstacles, we tend to see them as just that, obstacles, and start worrying about how are we going to overcome this, how are we going to manage this, could this derail us, where are we going to go? When we build the strategies for our conversations backwards, it starts creating benchmarks for us. In order to get to Z, I have to get to Y first. Well, in order to get to Y first, I've got to get to X first. And now what used to appear as obstacles now appear as opportunities. Because as we build it backwards, we're looking at them as these are things we can and need to achieve. So we end up creating building blocks and interim agreements along the way before we get to the final agreement we're going to need. So when we build our strategies, we don't build them forwards, we build them backwards. And when we build it, we want to build it in a way that's patient, that builds upon itself, and flows in a way so even if it feels like it might take a little longer on paper, we get to the solution or the agreement we're looking for quicker because we circumnavigated or at least prepared for many of the obstacles and areas of resistance that we would have run into. So we want to prepare backwards. And we want to make sure that we're aware and we're taking advantage of anything we can by preparing to our strengths, not from our strengths. So in general, that's the preparation piece. Once we feel prepared, it's time for action. It's time to sit down, stand up, meet somebody, have the conversation that you're excited to have. So when it comes time to have that conversation, we want to make sure that we're aware, that we're listening, and we're evaluating the totality of the communication that we're seeing. Let me ask you, how many of you have heard that when people lie, they do different things, either verbally or non-verbally? There's tells that people show when they lie. All right, shout them out. What are some of the ones you heard? That's a bunch of you. Just shout them out. This is an interactive process. Eye twitches. Okay. What's that?
Chewing nails.
Chewing the nails. What else?
See people with their mouth gets tight.
Okay, so they clench their jaw.
No eye contact.
Okay, could be lack of eye contact. What else? I'm sorry? Hesitation, yeah, long pauses. What else?
Hiding their hands.
Oh, hiding, maybe sitting on them or hiding them under their arms. Okay. What else?
Knowing the truth.
I'm sorry?
You actually know the truth.
Oh, well, that's easy. If you know the truth and you've got ground truth, then it doesn't matter what they're doing, right?
It's 100%.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right. In those situations, it will. So for all, yes, ma'am.
They cross their arms and sometimes also cross over their legs.
Okay.
Kind of like to protect them.
Yeah, so they might cross their arms, might cross their legs. Yep. Well, you guys are all kind of potentially maybe right. Good news is you're not wrong. You just might not be right 100% of the time. Let me tell you, there's no single behavior that's always indicative of truth or deception. It does not exist. If anybody ever tells you every time somebody scratches their nose or looks to the left or rubs their leg or rubs their eyes, rubs their eyes, whatever it might be that they're lying, that's not necessarily true. There is no single behavior that's always indicative of truth or deception. And I will take that one step further, and I will contend that there is no behavior that's indicative of deception at all. In fact, when we look at nonverbal behavior or changes in verbal behavior, and we say, I think that means somebody's being dishonest with me, we didn't detect dishonesty. What we detected was discomfort. We saw that somebody was uncomfortable at a moment in time. And then based on the context of the situation, either consciously or subconsciously, we assign the tag of dishonesty to that discomfort, not based on their behavior, but based on the context. So it's not the behavior that's important, it's the context. Context is king. So when it comes to evaluating communication in the conversations we have, I would encourage all of you not to look for any signs of truth or deception. Number one, if we go trying to catch somebody in a lie, we start creating a confirmation bias, which can start to greatly affect what we're seeing. On top of some other roadblocks that are there, that's probably the biggest one. So what I would encourage you to do is look for signs of comfort or discomfort. And then within the context of the situation, start assigning the most likely reasons for that comfort or discomfort. And we'll walk through how we do that in just a moment. It's a 4-step process. So please, when you go into these conversations, don't look for truth and deception. There's no point. We want to look for comfort and discomfort, and we want to do so in a way that creates strategic value. Just knowing that somebody lied to you, I would contend most of the time is like trivia. It's neat. Okay, great, you know he lied. Now what are you going to do? Unless knowing that somebody lied is enough for you to stand up and say thank you, but no thank you, and walk away, then just knowing that he lied serves you no strategic purpose, or very little strategic purpose at best. In life and in business, we have to have relationships and do business with people that lie to us all the time. It's just a fact of life. So if we want to create strategic value from the behavior that we observe, we have to go much deeper than that. And there's a 4-step process to doing it. The first step is we have to establish their truth-telling baseline. We have to establish their behavioral norm. If you're only going to remember a handful of things from this conversation, please remember this. You can't know what someone looks like when they're lying until you know what they look like when they're telling the truth. Period. You need a baseline of comparison. There is no single behavior that's always indicative of truth or deception. It doesn't exist. So if we go out looking for the behavior that means lie, that means deception, well, see ya. It's going to take a while. If you come up with it, let me know. Maybe we can get rich together. But it doesn't exist. Science hasn't identified it. So what we need to do at the start of any important conversation you have, buying or selling, negotiating, hiring, any conversation with your children or family, any conversation that you deem to be important, if you are going to attempt to evaluate behavior during that conversation, start the conversation by asking a handful, 3, 4, or 5 questions that your counterpart should have no reason to lie to you about. There should be no stress, there should be no discomfort, there should be no honesty. Weather, traffic, the game last night, Whatever it is, start the conversation with a handful of questions that they should feel comfortable answering. Now, as they're answering those questions, please mentally catalog their responses. How do they look, sound, and act when they're telling you the truth? Once you have that, you have your baseline for future comparison. You have their truthful behavioral norm. You can't know what someone looks like when they're lying until you know what they look like when they're telling the truth. The first and one of the most critical steps is going to be establishing that truthful baseline. Now, once you've established that truthful baseline, we want to observe behavioral clusters. Behavioral clusters are groups, multiple behaviors that change at the same time. And the reason why I said you were all kind of, sort of, probably right is because individually, each one of those behaviors might mean any number of things. But now if they start happening in a group, if we start seeing multiple nonverbal, multiple verbal, or a combination of multiple verbal and nonverbal behaviors changing at the same time, now those behavioral shifts carry more validity because it's not just one, it's a group. And we're not just evaluating one behavior, we're evaluating the groups of behavior. So step one is establish the norm. Step two is observe groups of behavior that change. The third step is identify the trigger that caused the behavioral change. What happened either right before or right as the behavior was changing? What caused it? First, set the norm. Second, observe the culture. That's what we're talking about, Mike. The cluster. And then identify the trigger. Now, the final part of this is you have to evaluate it within the context of the situation. And we evaluate it in the context of the situation by asking this question. Ask yourselves. Please don't ask it out loud. Ask this question. Why did this person's behavior change like that on time to this trigger in the context of this situation? Why did this person's behavior change like it did on time to this specific trigger in the context of this specific conversation? Context is king. Context is going to be the single most valuable indicator of information and intelligence. If you want to gain strategic advantages, if you want to add strategic value to any conversation you have, it's not just saying, oh, he crossed his arms and scratched his nose and coughed and his lips look dry, he must be lying. Now what? You might be right, but now what? The way to gain strategic value is to go through that process and say, okay, why did his behavior change like it did on time to that trigger in this context? When we can accurately answer that question, now we're gaining insight into their motivations, their intentions, their thoughts, feelings, concerns, fears. And now without them ever vocalizing those, we can say to ourselves, this is the goal I'm trying to achieve. This is their motivation, intention, fear, emotion, whatever it is. If that helps me, how do I use it? And if that could be an obstacle, how do I address it right now before it even gets verbalized so I can reduce that resistance on the way to achieving, if not my goal, another acceptable goal along the path? This is the key to unlocking that strategic value when you're reading the behavior. So now we're in the conversation. We're evaluating the behavior. We're gaining new intelligence. We're adapting our process as we go. As we continue to go and continue to work closer to our goals, it is going to be critical to help people save face and reduce their resistance. The strategic value will likely come from our plan and come from our observations. However, the engine that's going to drive this agreement is going to be our ability to help our counterparts save face. How do we help them feel better about accepting an agreement, a deal, an option, or alternative that wasn't theirs when they walked in the room? It's not about taking credit. It's about reaching the best agreement. There's a couple ways that we do this. The first one I want to share with you involves reducing resistance as we ask questions or make difficult statements. I think the majority of us have been conditioned that anytime we're in a debate or a negotiation, or as a friend of mine likes to say, robust conversation, we will ask a difficult question or we'll make a provocative statement. And then when we do, our counterpart disagrees or resists. And then when they disagree or resist, what do we do next? the perfect word. Now we justify why they shouldn't be disagreeing or shouldn't be resisting. So let me get this straight. We know we're going to ask a tough question or make a provocative statement, so we just ask it cold, like throwing a bucket of ice water on somebody's face. They show resistance, which increases the amount of resistance that we have to overcome because now they have publicly committed themselves to resisting your idea. So now their self-image is wrapped all around that flagpole they just stuck in the sand, and for the rest of this conversation, they don't have to focus on reaching an agreement. They just have to focus on maintaining the image and the position that they already committed themselves to. Makes our jobs exponentially harder. So what we do is if we know that we're going to ask a difficult question or make a provocative statement, we precede that question or statement with a reason or an excuse to help them begin to save face and see the potential merits of it before we even ask it. So what we start is we start the saving face process before we ask. Then when we ask the question, if they still resist, okay, it's public, but it would have been nice to avoid that, but at least now it's not as high as it was in the first example, and we can re-reference the reason or excuse we already used in order to go through the justification or persuasion process we need to at that point to find reasonable middle ground. Go.
Can you give an example of that?
Absolutely. So for what's your specific context? What are you looking for? Sales, negotiation, is it business, is it personal?
Business, yeah.
Okay, so you're in a business negotiation. Are you in production? Are you in sales? Are you in information?
It's more process improvement.
Okay. Okay, so if you need to, so you have to work with somebody in order to improve their process, make it more efficient, less time consuming, more profitable. Okay, if the current suboptimal process was their idea, they could be very emotionally tied to it. So you could walk in and say, as I take a look at this process coming in from the outside, it's very clear to me that we're probably wasting about 5 hours of productivity, and it's probably costing us 10 grand a day. So when we do that math, it looks like we need to change your process. Just punch them in the stomach. I mean, the ice water to the face as they hear that. Now, from us, it sounds perfectly logical because we're evaluating. It's our expertise. It's what we're saying. But we're trampling all over their self-image. So instead, we might want to say something like this. You know, as we come in and we take a look at the process that you have, clearly we want to make sure that we make it as efficient as possible. We want to save as much time, as much cost, and so that way we're more profitable. And I think as we take a look at this, if we could find a way to save maybe 15 minutes a day production time, we could then take that 15 minutes and put it in another area. And this allows us not only to expand our production, but allows us to increase our sales and increase our profit. And now I think in order to do that, it would be very important that bam. So we start by talking about, we're going to save time, we're going to increase profit, and then we get into it. You could even use a story as well. So if you're in consulting and you see this quite a bit, you know, there's only so many ways that you can design a process in the world, right? I don't know what that number is, but it's finite. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, you could say, you know what, this reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody about 6 months ago. It was a situation where they were very proud of the process they created. They had been successful. They had been profitable. But now what we had to do was talk about making some difficult incremental changes that could unlock a whole new level of profitability and scalability for them. So the first difficult piece was getting past the personal attachment they had to the process. So then we could start looking at where we could actually save time and save money. And once they came around, we ended up saving them $50,000 a quarter. And that was 50 grand that they could use to start paying off their debt and reinvesting in new equipment to make even more process improvements. So now the guy sitting across from me goes, oh, that sounds good. Okay, so here's what we need to do. But we preempt it instead of opening with the difficult idea. Does that help? Okay, very welcome. If you guys got questions, keep them coming. All right, here's one of the other things that I would very much like to recommend. Please stop saying the word you. And in your international conversations, please stop saying the international equivalent of the word you. Just like the example we just did. When we say the word you, we're trampling all over somebody's self-image. Former business partner of mine up in Orange County, he and I were having what he likes to refer to as a robust conversation in his dining room earlier this year. And he's a very intelligent guy I have a lot of respect for, guy I really enjoyed learning from. And about 40 minutes into this conversation, I was furious with him. Furious. Thankfully, I was aware enough at the time to ask myself, why am I so angry? I know this guy's really bright. I know he's really successful. I know he's trying to help me. And I know that, probably not all, but most of the ideas and points he's made are valid. They're pretty good. Why am I so angry? I mean, my fuse is burning. Like, this is going to escalate. And thankfully, before I crossed the point of no return, it dawned on me. He kept saying the word you. Mike, what you're thinking. Mike, what you're feeling. Mike, what you've done. Mike, what you want to do. Mike, the mistakes you've made. And it didn't matter that he was right or had good points. Every time he said the word you, my hands were getting higher and higher, because now I found the need to defend myself in this situation because I feel attacked. He was right. Thankfully, I was aware of that, and I calmed myself down. It was a conversation we could have after about the proper time and place to use the word you. So what we try to do is we try to speak in the third person. And by speaking in the third person, we say words like he, she, they, others, people, associates. A lot of times in conversations like this, we find ourselves thinking, feeling, doing. By saying that, we avoid trampling over somebody's self-image. We avoid increasing their resistance. And we allow ourselves to work towards an agreement because they don't feel like they're on an island. They don't feel like they're being attacked. So when it comes to saving face, those will be the two biggest takeaways.
These principles that you're coming out with, which are really kind of excellent, do they apply equally well when you're dealing in writing?
Yes. Yes. No. Well, for the depth we've gone into today, no. Of course, there's going to be exceptions and differences if we had a more in-depth conversation. One of the first negotiations I was brought in to consult on was in estate disagreement. Somebody had written a will. They had died before the will was completed. There were 3 siblings that were supposed to divide up a sizable amount of land and money down in Florida. This includes beachfront property and some other assets, right? One of the siblings had taken control of the estate and had pretty much squeezed out the other 2. The other 2, after 4 years, get me involved, and we start working through it. One of the first things we did, because all these negotiations are now over email, I took the word counter offer out of everything. Because if you make me an offer and I say, here's my counter offer, what am I telling you?
Reject.
Pardon my French for 1 second. I'm saying, your offer sucked, therefore you suck. I'm trampling all over your self-image. Your offer's not acceptable, you're not acceptable. So we started using the word proposal instead of counteroffer. We took the word you out of it. One of the things, I didn't put it in here, but if there's another phrase that you can take with you and please apply to every conversation you have, focus on the issue, not the person. Focus on the resolution, not the consequences. When you focus on the person, they feel like they need to defend themselves. It becomes combative, confrontational. So focus on the issue. Over the emails in that process, we always focused on the issue. And the issue was what the deceased had as their interest when the will was being constructed and the fair and equitable distribution. So the people were taken completely out of it. Everything we phrased, the word you was never in there. It was all about the issue. And then focus on the resolution, not the consequences. People try hard to avoid consequences. People will work together to achieve a resolution. So in order to keep the conversation going, we don't threaten people with consequences. We continue to try to stay focused on the resolution, whether we're having the conversation face-to-face or in writing. Thank you. Okay, so as we start to finish the circle that you saw earlier, asking effective questioning techniques. I'm sure you've all heard ad nauseum, stop asking closed-ended questions, right? They're great if you need to lock somebody into a detail or confirm something, but there's little to no strategic value by asking closed-ended questions. You know that. So as you're asking open-ended questions, please don't screw them up. I see a whole lot of very bright, very well-educated people get 90% of the way through an open-ended question and slam the door shut on the back end. So please explain to me your production process. I mean, I'm sure it starts here and ends here, right? It's a yes or no question. Way to go. You were 90% of the way through a great question and you slammed the door shut on the end. Don't answer it for them. Stay patient. For all you type A, alpha, go-getters, stay patient. You'll be surprised what people will tell you if you sit there quiet long enough and give them a chance to. Stay patient. Ask an open question, leave it open-ended, let them answer. Don't answer it for them. and don't turn it into a yes or no question. Right? Knock it off. Now, here's another question that I would like to throw out there for you to use as well. Assumptive questions. Now, in some of your training and some of your education, you might have heard assumptive questions being used to close sales agreements. My feeling and a lot of the research is if you're waiting to use them at the close, you've waited way too long, you've missed too many opportunities. And at this point, you really shouldn't be using them to close most of your sales agreements anyway, because it can damage rapport. It's an obvious tactic. It can undo a lot of hard work that you've done. So what I would like you to please remember are the concepts of how and when. Please don't ask somebody, can you do this? Did you do this? Please ask them, how long will it take? How many times have they done it? When was the first time? Bless you. When was the last time? How and when? How and when? I don't want to ask somebody if something happened. I want to ask them how many times it happened. Because as soon as they stop to think about it, what does that tell me? It's happened at least once, or they shouldn't have to think about it. So now as we go through the agreement process, by asking assumptive questions, it gets them at least openly acknowledging possibilities. It adds strategic value to the pool of information, gives us more information to work with. The structure of the questions themselves allow us more behavior, verbal and nonverbal, to interpret, more intelligence to gain and to incorporate into our conversation. And we end up making interim agreements along the way. So that way, by the time we get to the conversation, many of our agreements close themselves. Because using the assumptive questions, we've already agreed upon how long it takes, how much it costs, how many people, how much equipment, all these things. So by the time you get to the end of the conversation, it's virtually wrapped up, except for maybe a couple of details at the end. So please, obviously, avoid those closed-ended questions. Focus on asking assumptive questions, and please stop slamming the door shut on great open-ended questions. So some of you might be looking at just those 5 slides we went through and say, Mike, that sounds like a lot. That sounds like a lot to prepare for, sounds like a lot to keep in mind, sounds like a lot to juggle while you're having the conversation. It is. And the more you practice it, the more you rehearse it, the more you prepare for it, the more successful that you're going to be. And really what we're talking about is listening. That's why we call it disciplined listening. But we're not just listening with our ears. We're listening with our eyes. We're listening with our brains as we continually evaluate and integrate what we're seeing. How can it help us? Where do we need to go with it? So one last question for you guys today, and you've been great, thank you. What do you think is the most important part of listening?
Actively listening.
Close. Say it. The most important part of listening is talking. Good job. Because when we're talking, guess what we're not doing? And you know the one conversation you got to avoid the most? The one with yourself. It's okay to talk to yourself. It's only weird if you do it out loud. In your head, totally acceptable. When we are talking to ourselves, where is this going? What do we say? Where do we go? What's next? We're not concentrating on what we're seeing. We're not concentrating on what we're hearing. We're not concentrating on enhancing our strategic position in the conversation. What we're concentrating on is, oh crap, where do we go? What do we do next? I will tell you that for every interview, interrogation, negotiation, sale, leadership conversation, we work hard, if not to memorize, at least become incredibly comfortable through our process of anticipation with where do we need to go, how are we going to get there, what do we think the possible roadblocks and obstacles are going to be, and how do I handle them when they arise? So that way, once we enter the conversation, as these things happen, the responses just fall out. We were prepared, we're handling it, we knew this was coming, we knew it was going to happen, and that way we can focus all of our cognitive resources on evaluating, seeing, listening, hearing, integrating everything that's going on in front of us in order to help us achieve the results we're looking for. The most important part of listening is talking. You're the first guy to get that right in a long time, so congratulations. I give you a prize, I don't have one. So good job. So real quick, just to wrap up, the disciplined listening process is a cycle. When we enter into important conversations, this is something that we will execute over and over and over and over and over again throughout that conversation. It's not just a once and done. Throughout that conversation, we're going to continue to evaluate, we're going to continue to adapt. as you head out into the business world and you start, especially as we get into a more and more global economy, you start working with people from different cultures, both from the United States and from around the world. You start traveling to different places. Please remember, educate yourself. Become aware. Obviously show respect with the people that you talk with. Adaptation is going to be key. Please adapt to each of the environments and each of the people that you are going to speak with. Obviously, the more you practice, the more you prepare, the better. And when worse comes to worse, just ask. Most people will be very happy to talk to you about their culture and their community and their country and their background and their processes. Most people enjoy educating the rest of the world on that. So when in doubt, just ask. I think I'm right up against our time limit. So I want to say thank you guys very much. I really appreciate all the interaction. Thank you.